Corona pandemic shows us very clearly that our elixir of life is truth, and the possibility to perceive it, to feel it, and to speak about it. Lies and twists make us ill, physically and mentally, and that leads to craziness and chronic disease. And human beings tend to submit to offenders if they are brought into a superior situation. This is referred to as the Stockholm Syndrome. Things of true social behavior has nothing to do with this. This is a wrong we between people who have a wrong ego or no ego at all. If one thinks that money and participation makes the human being happy, is misled. Both makes people lonely, and it only leads to hate of those who are tried to be suppressed. Putting shame on others is nothing else than trying to relieve our own bad consciousness, which will never work out in the long run. We have to ask the rich and the beautiful and the powerful what they are trying to cover up. The Corona pandemic is also covering the money system, which got to its limits in 2008, and more projects have to be set up to enlarge profits even further. And in my view, Corona seems to be a psychological warfare of those who have money and want to make more money far beyond the normal person's imagination.
Es ist im Endeffekt ein globaler Krieg gegen die Mitmenschlichkeit.
But I want to find out who in my ministry started this. Was that my predecessor, Mr. Seehofer himself, who was involved? What was the motivation? Is there any kind of scientific consideration in this? I think this needs to be fully clarified in order to draw the possible consequences and take the people out of their positions if they are still in. We discussed this yesterday already. From my point of view, it is of no help as such to create a panic, especially if we have noted that this is rather a kind of hyperventilation or misjudgment of the situation right from the start. And if we go beyond that panic to looking at the people, from my point of view, this is not politically feasible.
If it is true that lies and intransparency make you physically ill, whereas the truth and clarity make you healthy, then this could be an answer. Just be transparent, just tell the population clearly what actually happened, because only if people understand what happened, that panic was artificially created without any basis for it. Never forget that there were two papers within the Ministry of Interior Affairs. First of all, the panic paper, which was publicized, and the other one was the false alarm paper, where another staff member of the ministry showed quite clearly, somebody who approached this from the point of view of civil protection, clearly showed that there is no evidence for an epidemic situation of national scope, but at the same time there are numerous indications of the fact that the measures are dangerous, lethal, and economically destructive. I wonder how could this happen at the same time in the same ministry, in the Home Ministry, because this false alarm paper never was attacked in terms of its contents by anyone. Nobody claimed that it was incorrect. Why did it not have any impact? I think it has to do with the media as well. The media just transported this. And I think we have to look at these things, not only because at the end we we wish to hold those responsible liable, but also because we need the population to understand what they were manipulated into believing, so they can say there's no basis, I've been cheated. I think, well, to put it ironically, they are crying murder because of the takeover of power by the Taliban in Afghanistan, but you might say that the scientific Taliban have taken over in our country together with masks and rituals and a religious that goes along with this. If people keep wearing masks all over the place, it doesn't affect the infection rate at all. It doesn't make a difference in different states of the US where you have these requirements or not. So you can't justify it scientifically anymore. You know it from religious beliefs that physical infringement is favored, such as circumcision, etc. It's similar here. So rationally, you can't justify this anymore. Rationally, we have all the figures, all statistics are available, and it should have been clear for a long time that there is no risk for the population as a whole, and above all, assuming that it is dangerous, let's assume that it is, then the attempt to combat it politically by repressing the population as a whole is not helpful. And we can prove that this wasn't helpful, so this should have been discontinued much earlier. Germany is a country governed by authorities, as the Home Minister said earlier. In other states, this comes directly from the scientists. In Switzerland, in the UK, in the US, you don't have this sort of governmental power base. And there are politicians and other people who believe that there is this risk for the population, and they believe that they have to save them. So horror scenarios are created, and then ever more measures, ever deeper measures are developed. And I would liken that to religious fanaticism, and then more and more people jump on the bandwagon. Politicians who can increase their popularity by portraying themselves as saviors. And let's not forget Mr. Söder, the Minister-President of Bavaria. He likes to do this sort of thing, and he might actually yet become Chancellor. He would like to be anyway. Media groups can increase their sales that way. Economic companies, businesses can increase their sales. The President said that the government now has started printing money without restraint. So the cost is transferred to future generations. If the taxpayer had to pay for this now, then there would be some limit to this. So my forecast is this is no longer within the Ministry of Science, because we don't have a rational approach anymore. It's more comparable to phenomena like we had them historically, such as witch hunts, religious zeal. So there's the witch hunters, the politicians, the kings who save us from this. In the 1920s, it was scientifically proven that the world is about to come to an end because inferior genes are spreading. We have to stop this through forced sterilization, etc. So it has been said that we no longer are in an age of enlightenment, which started 200 years ago. This is wrong. We are exactly in the same age as the Taliban. We are possessed by fanaticism, pushed by fanaticists, by fanatics, and via panic scenarios, they manage to stop a lot of people from thinking. So it is really sufficient to have very basic statistic knowledge to see that there is no risk for the population as a whole, and that a virus is, of course, circulating, and so you need to strengthen your immune system. And if it's weakened for any reason, you have to be careful. But that is a question of individual adaptation of your behavior. That is not a task for politicians or for politics.
Which seems to be the case here if, in the end, we have a deliberate action by whoever, a deliberate offense, there won't be immunity for anyone.
Excuse me, let me speak for scientists. There are contingent circumstances. We know the names. We know it's the same people who, in 2009, tried to impose the same thing in the context of the swine flu. Back then, the health minister was able to prevent this, and now this wasn't possible. It's the same people then, and I wouldn't really expect them to be evil-minded, but maybe more possessed. So that's possible that scientists are possessed of an idea. So we can go back all the way to Plato. He had the idea, that's also a form of possession, that philosophers have recognized the good, and the good is means that people can tell people how they should behave. That goes all the way to eugenics, all the way to telling people who they are allowed to marry. So that is a kind of madness. And it's an old story, this kind of fixation. I think the psychologists, there are on the cabinet more people who know more about psychology than I do. That is a type of fixation. That's always been around. It's always the same people. Drosten in Germany, Ferguson in the UK, 2009, and this time they managed to impose their will. In 2009, it was possible to call them back in good time, but this time it wasn't possible. The Home Ministry did that in Germany. It's always been an authoritarian state, really. And unfortunately, several decades of democracy didn't change that in Germany. It's the state who does that. The state has its scientists, and they are imposed, and everybody else is suppressed. But that's not the whole picture, because in other countries, in Switzerland, that's not what unfolded. It was the scientists themselves who are not they instituted themselves as a task force, and that's not envisaged by the Constitution, of course, and they assumed the role of making prescriptions for politicians. And similarly, in the UK government, the Tories didn't strive to terrorize the population, but based on horror calculations that they didn't immediately understand, presented by Ferguson. The same goes for the US government by Trump, who was also driven by scientists. It's not always, maybe in Germany that is the case, that it starts with politicians, because politics don't normally have that power. It's oftenly based on scientists who also have their own interests, or they represent other people who have certain interests. That's not necessarily planned, based on a plan. That's not a conspiracy behind it. It just happens. And also, of course, printing money is involved here. If politicians get convinced that they can print money without consequences.
It's important that we have the analyses on one side, what went wrong, who was responsible. Quite clearly, I've said so. But we have to look at the possible solution as well. The question which the Minister of Interior asked was, how did this come about? And this panic system that we have is 𝗔𝗔𝗆𝗺𝗔 by in the limbic system. getting input from all sensories without that input being rationalized. So we are brought to panic by our perception, by the collective nocebo effects. Maybe I could comment here that currently we are dealing with the effects of the fear, because it's not mere panic constellations that the people are in with acting out of effect, but over the long time of living in this problematic situation, I think there have been shifts in the society, marriages breaking up due to different views to these topics. We have families breaking up, so people are not just in fear, but they have the scrambles of their life in front of them, and they have to see how to get along, how to survive. They are moved out of their homes and so on as a consequence. So this is great social shifts that we are seeing here, and maybe we should analyze this in the different areas: children, elderly, working people. What are the observations to be made here? We have a high number of suicides, people are depressive. These are things that we have to look at in more detail and see how to develop an overall solution. Of course, all this triggered by fear and panic, but now enforced and settled in the situation with more aggressiveness, maybe due to the mask or the situation that people in, so level of aggressivity is rising. So we should look at what the situation of the society is. Professor 𝗲𝗺𝗃 worked on a research that didn't only find out the masks are senseless, but they are risky because up to 7 times more CO2 concentration is behind the mask.
Yes, we measured it with 45 children in inhaling, exhaling, mixed breathing, and we measured only the inhalation periods for 3 minutes and then the exhalation periods with a relatively sensitive gauge that responds to CO2 concentration. So we have about 1,500 to 2,000 parts per million, or 0.2% carbon dioxide. We have about 400 parts per million outdoors, 0.4%, and we measured 13,000 parts per million after 3 minutes. We don't know what happens if children wear these masks for a longer period. There's no data for this. We know that the FFP2 masks are treated by labor protection measures, that workers who wear them have to take them off after half an hour. Our health minister knows that better than I do. Then they have to take it off, take a break, and then they're allowed to put them back on again. And with children, they're allowed to wear it all day long, or 4, 5, 6, 7 hours, depending on how long they are. And some never take them off, even if they run around the schoolyard during their breaks. And so it's not surprising that colleagues of the University of 𝗏𝗃𝗃, in surveying more than 25,000 children, found that more than 68% of children experience side effects, headaches, aggression, depression, etc. Those are all consequences of an excessive carbon dioxide in the system. That is one side, but we also should take into consideration, you said it earlier, our immune system against respiratory viruses is in our mouth and neck area. And there was a recent study by the Charité clinic in Berlin that children have immunocompetent cells that are part of the unspecific immune system that immediately fight off any viruses without any symptoms occurring. We don't know what happens with these children if they have a mask on all day long.
That it's not just fear, it is also a constellation in which people are driven by force and restricted by apply the precautions. They really had to do irrational things to follow the rules. I can't be on a park bench alone anymore, or partly the people had to sit. They were approached by the police because there's two people sitting on a park bench, and people don't understand why they're not allowed to demonstrate. So that's a very tight set of rules and a humiliating set of rules, which has quite a different regime as to what one would expect in a free democratic society, which we all thought to be living in.
You have to empower people to exercise or exert power themselves, everyone individually. People were abused and were taken to this position where they were pushing each other around, but they were bullied themselves. They were bullied by the police, and it can be said that these policemen were bullied themselves, but the state has really gone after the citizens and created requirements that, for instance, in hospitals you can only work with masks, or you can only enter with a test or whatever. It is a level of regulations never seen before, where you suddenly had to meet requirements that you weren't aware of. In the past, you could simply go any place you wanted to. Now you have, if you want to go to Greece, you have to announce that you're traveling. You have to announce it days ahead of time. Now you have to fill in a form if you want to go to a restaurant. So we need to hear someone from the health ministry. The tracking app didn't even turn out to have any efficacy. And at the very beginning of the pandemic, we suddenly did something that we never had done for years. We stood in the window at 8 p.m. and applauded the nursing staff and the other people, people at the checkouts, etc., to thank them. I don't know if you remember this.
I remember this very hollow gesture because it was very hollow.
But it triggered a lot in society, because all of a sudden there was some respect vis-a-vis the people in the supermarkets. That's very essential function. Sale, nursing of elderly, etc. Those are the least paid people. Police, security, etc. And we paid them a certain respect that way, which was way overdue, and that way got them to assuming a task they shouldn't assume at all. Because all of a sudden I went to a supermarket and a staff member of the supermarket will said, mask, you're not wearing a mask. They were given, maybe assumed a job, that psychologically assumed it, because that wasn't their job at all.
The gesture itself was cheap. It was cheap, and it could well be and it would be a bad thing to have this. Now, this was the case.
Because it's a behavior that is not really constructive, and in the context of a certain opinion or an internal attitude, and we exercise this attitude, then we internalize it. It becomes our opinion. That is psychologically proven since the 1960s. It's been very well researched. And that's exactly what happened. This is what happened. Staff members were used that way because they were put in a position where they had to pretend like an emergency is at hand. We actually abused people. They were turned into tools here because they are in a system of dependency, and they rarely were self-determined because the system is such that it promotes adjustment So people are not self-determined. People are really trained to adapt, and the system is hierarchical. So the system was used to induce fear into people. And if we look at the irrational situation here, for instance, I can remember an intensive care worker who's told me how grotesque she finds it that a person who is supposed to be treated in the intensive care unit is not allowed to see her relatives anymore. And of course, she was then taken to the ICU, to the intensive care unit, and you don't know if she comes back out again anymore and sees her family anymore. And you can think, like, are you crazy? If a nurse can wear protective gear, then why can't family members do that and go along? That's crazy. And if somebody with a positive CT value comes along and dies in a nursing home, then the family are not allowed to say goodbye to them anymore. They are put into a body bag, the zipper is closed, and then basically disposed of under certain conditions. So these are human abuses by the people who work there, who really train their ethical standards as well. They should ethically work in a different way, but they go along with this, even though they know that there is no justification for this, medically, no justification.
It leads to a complete failure of any humanity, and there is no possible way to see this as acceptable, not even Ebola. We have no evidence here. And this is not even covered by these hollow gestures, as we've just seen. On the contrary, here the emptiness of these gestures is made clear. And what has impressed me most in our earlier work as the investigative committee, Dr. Sonner's presentation, that he said that he wanted to get money from a cash machine and went into the bank room. There's another person there. He didn't have a mask. It was an elderly woman who wore a mask, and she shied away from him, said, "No, you have to wear a mask." And Dr. Wanner first of all tried to talk to her, saying, "You don't have to wear a mask." "I don't, you don't." "Yes, I have to. I don't want to be infected. I have an ill husband at home." And then he said, "What about these arguments?" And he did what I think you mentioned as affiliation, the difference of association. He went to her, took her mask off, and she started to cry because nobody had embraced her for 1.5 years. That is what we have to get to. And I think prohibiting mask wearing would make sense. You just have to take the example, move forward, stay calm, and say there's nothing to it. If you walk the roads without mask in trains, you're not putting anybody at risk. You're solidarity with people who follow the precautions that harm them. And it's like in all religions, it is told you that they are good for your health and whatever, not the good of your soul in this case. The biological survival, that is something that you're moving against with examples and showing how much lies there are around. I get loads of emails also from the academic area where I read exactly what you quote. the mail that he quoted from the company, Mr. Chancellor, this is something that has to be counteracted, and a reassessment of the ethical values. It's the contrary of solidarity and the scientific authority. As I said, it's elementary statistics to find out the lies here, and it's a question of whether this is deliberate or not. Every scientist knows elementary statistic, so everybody who takes, any scientist who takes 10 minutes of their time would find this out. There's not really much to it, so why don't they do it? Is that deliberate? Is that deliberate? I think it is cognitive misleading, just like any Christian should have seen there were no witches in the medieval ages, just like any biologist could have seen immediately that there is no bad genes that threaten the survival of humankind, and there is a certain desire to power. Of course, scientists think they know more than the rest of the population, which is right. And as such, if you want to build an aircraft to fly to the US with, you need engineers who know how to do this, and you need the science to it, of course. But if people think that they are ethically privileged, deciding what is good and what is bad and how society should work, they are a massive risk and danger for the society, and they are misusing their authority, and these people need to be stopped. And I can only do this by information. I don't know if justice will help something, so we have to move against this. The idea is not scientists with an authority who want to protect us of something, that the good people, like the medical people or the religious leaders who take us to our saviors, this is a crazy idea, a mad idea, which does not correspond to what being a human being means, that every citizen has the freedom to come to their own conclusions. And this is what I would appeal for, that you can't fall crazy due to the panic and leave your own ability to assess things behind. Do we agree that without this panic paper and the following panic created by the government and the media, it couldn't have gone this far, or does anybody disagree? Because then the question would be, is the situation thinkable? And we have to ask Professor Wallach and Professor Ruppert, and maybe Professor Eshfeld as a philosopher. Is it a situation possible in which such a targeted panic against a complete population is justifiable, or wouldn't that be justifiable or possible in any other way? Of course it's possible, but would it be justifiable ethically to act against the own population in such a way? Power is institutionalized by fear. So people who are well off, who are happy about their lives, who have opportunities to design their lives, you can't put something over them, but you have to take their means away from them to lead their own lives, make objects of them, and then you can use fear and get anything with it.
There is no knowledge, no real knowledge that cannot be clearly communicated. Lies can only be justified if you say you have a religious revelation that you had or something similar that yet you cannot communicate to others. And there is no such thing. This is not knowledge. If you have knowledge about a threat, then you can talk about it and you can say it in a way that everybody can understand it. Everybody can understand it with the Ebola virus, and here everybody can see within 2 minutes that there is no such threat. And then it's obvious that there is never a need for the lie.
I cannot imagine that Helmut Schmidt at the time, when he did that Helmut Schmidt moment in the flood disaster at the time, that he thought about lying to the population. It wouldn't have been possible. Everybody was there with the water in front of them. I'm sitting in front on my roof. I see the water. I see the risk. So there was no need for additional panic. On the contrary, and he did that at the case, the population had to be kept calm. They had to surpass rules, and he did so, which were just bureaucratic. So I wouldn't, and I have never heard from not from Professor Ruppert, neither from Professor Wallach, I haven't heard anything that there could be any possible situation thinkable to justify an artificial risk to allow some measures.
Truth is our elixir of life and elixir of truth, and nobody should assume the right to withhold the truth from others. And that is exactly what I would call our greatest resilience, namely that we can live with the truth and therefore can then also take our own decisions. That's my experience. You can trigger enormous Swedish saying which says, shine the lamp of truth without burning the other's beard.
So there must be an offer to talk, but no intrusion. I think that is the experience of the life that we all have. I hope it's going to bear fruit. I'm happy to be in this with all my heart and soul, and there's a lot at stake, and the people who are concerned that I see, especially the ones that we wanted to protect, the old and the ill, how they were damaged and harmed, and I still see how the system is fixed, especially the so-called health system is really on that route and still on it. But whatever, we have to get off, and I'm ready to do and help with anything I can. All the best of luck. So what happened in the sciences? We've heard it from Professor 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, other sides as well, Professor Schwab. As far as the juridical sciences are concerned, Professor 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 told us that a part of the established science, as it was summarized in Leopoldina, took their leave. How could that have happened? Well, that is conformity, really. You have a couple of scientists who created the panic. Politicians jumped in on it, media jumped in on it, and once that train got going, it's difficult to stop it. So I would say there's loads of scientists who understand it but don't have the balls to go up against it, because it may cost external funds. The university directorate will be up against them, and they have to be able to kick them out, and so on. All these things that as scientists are not moral or ethically better people than others are. So it's a pressure of conformity. Is that because of third-party funds? I would say we need more organization bottom up. Of course, that's a state organization of research. If the state, they should, and this is the justification, is the state is neutral. If you have private universities, private companies, so that's not individual people, but companies, corporations, with respective funds, if that's funded, of course, they have certain interests, and the interest is not the pure truth, but the finding to help them. And the state is not in that situation, and that has collapsed. We see it's worst in the state because state has biggest power. So if politicians once got on this lead because it gave them power, that is used to the full extent, and the same applies in science as it's well. If you vote against this, you get into trouble. And the worst concentration of power we see is that in the hands of the state, because it pretends to be neutral, protecting the people. And we see that this is going as far as to scientists who simply say the truth, the scientific truth about the searches of the homes of Professor 𝗕𝗃𝗃, for example. It's state of the art. We know that if that is put into an expertise, the police knocks at the door. So we are not in a state where we are ruled by law, of course, so these people are trying to make them shut up. If you see this, of course, it's a hurdle to say something against this.
Nobody commanded that to the scientists. Well, in Germany they did, because we have the academies that are directly controlled by politics, but internationally that is not the way. Scientists did it on their own free will. They put themselves into the center stage and they steamrolled others, and you can't counteract that with any regulation. You can only stop this by promoting pluralism, by allowing different views and ideas without trying to control it from the top. So I think controlling this from the top is impossible. You can't control the freedom of the sciences. You can only try to avoid, to remove obstacles to such pluralism and freedom. Academies are usually designed to allow discussion about diverging ideas and viewpoints, scientific viewpoints. And if politicians get involved here and they expect scientists to second their agenda, then that's the end of that. But you can't stop that via regulations. You can enlighten the population so that they won't listen to that kind of science anymore. This is only possible because it is reflected by scientists, supported by scientists and politicians, and that can actually damage science to a large extent, because people won't believe scientists anymore.
We are again facing a psychological problem that if, in the ideal case, in a utopia, we could assume that the person giving third-party funds is interested in the truth, this ideal case at this point in time is destroyed. At that time, I'm not going to have any trust in any statement coming from Charité, and I'm not going to have any trust at any point from anybody from Leopoldina, because what I've seen so far is far enough for me to see that the damage that was caused, this loss of confidence and trust, is going to be remedied even in part in the near future. I think we need completely new build of trust. Maybe Leopoldina will try to re-establish their renunciation, their renownedness, as they had, with a couple of exceptions that I can't assume or imagine that the population thinks lots of different from me, that they will again follow this utopia again.
But of course, exactly what you say, Chancellor. As soon as this is exposed, it didn't take so long, a year and a half, the Leopoldina lost their credibility. They won't repeat that. And there are attempts to regain credibility, and basically you have to go via the checkbooks in politics there. That's the only way. If you depart from the truth, it will be exposed. And in this case, it happened very quickly, because the hazard risk from a virus can be verified. So the Charité lost its credibility, and the same thing will not repeat, because you notice that if you allow yourself to be abused by politics and play the tune of the politics, then you lose your credibility.
Of course, if you're not able to truthfully talk and see an objective truth without any strings attached and look for it, you're not going to find it anyway. So both sides are right in this, and Mr. Wallach, I think, brought this up quite rightly. There's only the truth value, yes or no, but there are situations where it can't be determined because it's gray. So then it may be true that one tries to find the truth, but in this process and also in scientific research, it's only approximately.
Just like Mr. Wallach said, you have to have the culture to do this, a critical culture. You have to pursue the truth, otherwise we don't need to talk to each other, because then you'll have one group of scientists agreeing that Corona is a killer virus, and another group of scientists who are here today believe that it's not the case, and one group has more power than the other. End of story. Well, then I don't need to waste my time on this Sunday to participate in this if there is no truth. Of course, we have reasons, we have arguments, we believe that what they say are lies, deliberately distributed lies, but we can only have this opinion because we believe that there is a truth. And if we want to verify the claims of the others, we find that they can't be true. We've observed here that there are structures that the previous government financed, for instance, fact-checker organizations or hate speech organizations, anti-hate speech organizations that had a very tunnel vision view of the world. So hate speech elements but it was very unilateral approach. Some were switched off to support monopoly structures. One has to wonder, why is a monopoly such as YouTube accepted? And if you accept it, why don't you use the government to actively stop YouTube to do as they please, so that people who communicate certain contents have to go to court before they can get their voice back?